Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Islam.
To me, a mosque is a prayer area and also a social area where, especially in this country, in the United States, where we don't really have too much communication with the Islamic world, or, we're not really living in an Islamic society. Our way of communication.
Personally, I have been thinking about this problem, and I think the solution is to go back to Islam.
I think change is really necessary. It hasn't come yet, and I think Muslims living here in America can provide some of that leadership or that insight that will help the Muslim world bring itself up.
The image even Muslim women have of themselves and others is often that of a passive, do-nothing kind of a person. Miswa is bringing together professional women as well as just regular, everyday women together in an active role.
I think when we come to that realization, then we can begin to tackle the very difficult problems in our social fabric here in America and begin feeling that we are part of the American society, a part of the American decision-making process.
And yet at the same time, there are abuses, and needless abuses of women's rights in the Muslim world. Now, this always pains me when I think that when Islam emerged in the 7th century, it was women who were the first converts.
We have to settle certain issues, our stand vis-a-vis freedom and the freedom of thinking and the freedom of expression.
So democracy is essential for the transition to an Islamic state, and it is essential for the establishment and the survival and the flourishing of an Islamic state.
A faith that is alive is a faith for people and societies. Muslims generally believe Islam to be so. However, despite what Muslims believe Islam to be, Islam continues to be judged by others according to how Muslims behave and act. And this image, sadly, is that of a faith totally void of any social benefits for mankind, completely out of touch with the realities of today.
Personally, I have been thinking about this problem, and I think the solution is to go back to Islam. Individually, I believe every Muslim should bring another brother back to Islam. So there are so many Muslims. They are not coming to mosque and praying, so we should definitely try them to come back to Islam.
What is wrong with Muslims? In my opinion, they are not acting, not behaving like what Muslims should behave. They are more or less following the customs and cultures of the different communities and countries they come from. If they would only put all that aside and follow Islam for what Islam is, I'm sure we'll be able to solve most of our problems.
There is talk of an Islamic revival, and it appears that many Muslims are trying not only to understand the reasons for what is happening to them, but why it is that they find themselves in such a mess. There is a growing feeling that only by understanding and acknowledging problems can they ever hope to come up with badly needed solutions.
I think it's important that the Muslim community in the world has to treat itself as a member of the world community in general and interact with everyone in an even way in order for them to help pull the Muslim world out of the pit that it's in. And I think a change is really necessary. It hasn't come yet, and I think Muslims living here in America can provide some of that leadership or that insight that will help the Muslim world bring itself up.
Most practicing Muslims agree that the essential problem with Muslims is that they've fallen away from the Quranic guidance. Very often when Muslims sit and reflect on their status, they come away with the conclusion that they must return to the Quran. But what do the words return to the Quran really mean?
The Quran's aim is not to talk about God, because God is there, He is complete in Himself. The aim of the Quran is man. And belief in God is absolutely essential in order to keep the conduct of man right. Therefore, unlike Christianity, for example, which always has been talking about what is the nature of God and so on and so forth, whether it is love or what, the Quran of course says that God has unlimited mercy, but its main aim is to rectify the human conduct. Now, in human conduct, of course, you have the individual and the family, then you have the society. In society, you have the political side, you have the economic side, and you have the sex or family side, and you have education, and you all sorts of things. So it gives you, or economics, it gives you certain principles for these fields. It does not give you ready-made systems, because nobody can give ready-made systems. And if a system is ready-made today, tomorrow it won't work. So it gives you principles to work these systems out at each stage.
No, you see, you cannot take any book like this, like the Quran, literally always only. It must be studied with an endeavor to understand it. There are many verses in the Quran which are clear-cut and as laws, for example, injunctions, and others which are allegorical. And the Quran itself says that there are muhkamat verses, that means verses which are clear in and by themselves, and others which are mutashabihat, that means which are allegorical or metaphorical. And that is precisely the object of the study of the Quran, to discern between such as are muhkamat, which means clear in and by themselves, and others which are allegorical or metaphorical.
First of all, we are born, we live, and we die. Where we come from and where we go has not differed by the fact that we ride in planes rather than on camelback. The ultimate reality of the human state has not changed. And the Quran contains, first of all, the teachings as to where we come from, and the map as to where to go safely to reach our final home, which is back to God. Therefore, in the basic element, which is the meaning of human life, the intellect of human life, and the destiny of human life, the Quran's message is as cogent now as it has ever been. Secondly, the Quran contains all the knowledge that is necessary for all generations of Muslims until the end of time. And therefore, whatever situation we face, which as a community might be different from other situations, the key to the understanding of it and the solution of it lies in the understanding of the Quran, of course with the help of the Hadith and the traditional commentaries which over the centuries have been given. I am very much opposed to the tendency which exists among so many modernized Muslims influenced by Western thought and secularism of cutting the 1400 years which separate us from the advent of the Quran and all of the sapiental commentaries upon the Quran which have been written, and positing ourselves with our head filled with ideas drawn from Oxford and Cambridge and MIT and Harvard and other places, and then going and opening up the text of the Quran and saying all these people for the last 1400 years have been wrong, this is what the Quran means. That kind of guidance can also be a misguidance. When we read now what some of these preachers in Syria and Egypt around 1900, around the year 1300 of our era, wrote about this verse of the Quran corresponding to the pastor's discovery of microbes and this other corresponding to this and that, looks very stale now because all those scientific discoveries have now changed. So it's not in this sense that I mean that the verses of the Quran correspond to our situation here right now. It is not right to simply try to make the Quran a book of science because we happen to be very impressed by modern science. Modern science changes very rapidly. It is in itself in a very great state of crisis, and it's very shallow and short-sighted for us to compare the eternal Word of God to passing human science. But the experiences of man in whatever period of life he lives in, what that meaning, the meaning of that experience, whether we are now here in Washington with you, or if we're now sitting down, let's say in Rabat, Morocco or someplace, that experience, the meaning of it, can always be found in the teachings of the Quran, provided we also do not destroy all of the stages of commentaries over the century which relate us to the Quran itself.
Obviously, there are differences in outlook and interpretation of this key operative principle, which we all agree is essential for reworking and reconstructing the socio-moral fiber of this society in order to construct a more ideal society. Muslims are faced with not only rediscovering the original meanings of old symbols, but also in finding new symbols to convey that meaning afresh. Muslims must understand, articulate, and enact what Islam means to them on a personal level. And only then can they hope to bring about the desired changes for their own societies and for the rest of the world at large. Starting from there, they can look at the challenges from the outside that are impacting on them. It seems that in their journey from the actual to the ideal, Muslims have a lot of ground to cover. Just as this society is in a turmoil for many different reasons, secularism, materialism, consumerism, and whatever other ism may apply, Muslim societies are also in an equal, if not greater, state of turmoil. Muslims presently find themselves without power or unity. It matters little if they comprise the majority in any given area or are living as a minority. As a minority, having to face additional pressures, they have to analyze and discover within Islam what the Islamic response should be. The mosque remains the center of a Muslim spiritual guidance, and where Muslims live as a minority, the mosque plays an expanding role in catering to the educational and social needs of the community.
The mosque to me is, well, first of all, it's a house of Allah, a house of God, worship area. And really, to me, a mosque is a prayer area and also a social area where, especially in this country, in the United States, where we don't really have too much communication with the Islamic world, or, you know, I mean, we're not really living in an Islamic society. Our way of communication, you know, to finding out the important dates of, you know, the important dates in the Islamic calendar, you know, our celebrating our feasts, you know, just a place where it's open to Muslims to just interact with each other, and also, well, maybe I should just sum it up, a social and a religious area, and mainly a service organization.
As Muslim society stands presently, the greatest amount of poverty and the greatest amount of opulence are both found there. The reasons for this paradox are many, but are primarily due to the lack of education, the lack of industrial progress, and the lack of economic development, not to mention their recent colonial past. Along with all of these, there is a pathetic lack of leadership, which virtually assures the Muslim masses nothing but misery and chaos.
We have to settle certain issues, our stand vis-a-vis freedom and the freedom of thinking and the freedom of expression, our stand regarding democracy, which will be the only viable way of surviving. I'm talking about democracy as a methodology, not as an ideology, because our ideology is Islam, but I'm talking about the method. We have to settle once and for good the women's rights issues, not through talking, but through actually acting and performing. And we have to settle the right of others within our circles. I mean, the right of non-Muslims, the opposition, the right of dissent, etc. We cannot deal with these issues by saying Islam is the solution or Islam is the greatest system. Granted it is, but whether we could grasp this greatness in reality or not, that's another challenge.
Maturation of the political processes within Muslim countries is yet to be realized in most instances. Governments exist, but few of them are truly representative of the people's aspirations and interests. Meanwhile, the debate continues as to whether Islam is for democracy or against it, and also whether a Caesar-God dichotomy is allowable and will even work in a Muslim world.
Democracy is essential for the transition towards an Islamic state, and is essential as a foundation of the Islamic state. The basics of Islam are in the minds and the hearts of the Muslim majority, but democracy, that means the expression of the will of the people. It should control everything. In the transitional period, it is necessary to know what is the role of an Islamic state in a contemporary society and in the contemporary world, because I believe that there is a qualitative difference between the social circumstances and world circumstances now and in the past. And then democracy is essential for the Islamic State itself, because the principles of Quran and Sunnah and the rules are limited, and there is a spacious room for dealing with emerging issues and the technical or social or dealing with the environment or in any field. And the will of the people needs to be expressed through their representatives, and also the minorities. All the rights of the minorities should be secured, and they would feel more comfortable under a democracy. So democracy is essential for the transition to an Islamic state, and it is an essential for the establishment and the survival and the flourishing of an Islamic state.
For Muslims, there is comfort in the fact that there are over 1 billion of them across the world. Sadly enough, though, the literacy rate amongst them is generally close to the lowest. It is even more tragic that half of the total Muslims who are women are even further down on the literacy scale. On this issue, Muslim men are repeatedly blamed, as well as Islam itself.
Whatever we want to make the interpretation of this verse easy to the women, الرجال قوامون على النساء, we have to understand from this verse that the leadership in Islamic system is being left to the men. And believe me, when the men are practicing this authority, the women are not feeling this responsibility at all.
Muslim women, especially in the West, are not only speaking out, but are assuming their own social responsibilities.
Well, you know, the image even Muslim women have of themselves and others is often that of a passive, do-nothing kind of a person. Miswa is bringing together professional women as well as just regular, everyday women together in an active role to project an image of an activist woman, which is the true image of the woman in Islam.
I think the agenda is now ours as Muslim women to rewrite how we see ourselves, how we see our religion. I don't want to reject Islam, and yet at the same time I want to have a full life as a human being and as a woman. And if that means rewriting the way Islamic interpretation has seen me, then that is what I'm going to do.
During the Rushdie affair, one of the British ministers wrote to several leaders of the Muslim community in Britain, urging them to cooperate by assimilating into the life and culture of the country they had chosen to settle in. The problem of assimilation for any minority is a very real one, and Muslims are no exception.
Our responsibility to begin intellectually understanding that Islam and the West are not at odds, that there is much in common between the two, but there's actually an overlap between Islamic civilization and its advancements and Western civilization today.
To take the isolationist approach would signify that Islam is irrelevant to the kind of world in which we live today.
I think one of the problems is that Muslims still feel that they are alien to the decision-making process. Part of it is justifiable. we are being excluded from the process. But part of it is also self-inflicted. We exclude ourselves because either of a superiority complex, for example, or basically we don't understand the system, or we are suspect that the system will not conclude to our favor in addressing the political and social problems facing Muslims throughout the world.
Industrialization of the Muslim societies seems to be progressing at a snail's pace, except in countries like Malaysia. While a lack of capital and a skilled labor force may be the main reasons for this, could it also be that Muslims have lost their initiative? Although a variety of attitudes towards modernization continue to exist, there's a growing awareness among Muslims of the reality of modern change. Many questions remain, such as what change, how much change, what is the Islamic rationale for the change, and whose interpretation should prevail. These questions are only natural and must not be understood as confusion among Muslims. These are in fact signs of hope that Muslims are now beginning to exercise the principle of ijtihad, analytical reasoning, which has rendered for them in the past a glorious civilization. To order a copy of this program, please call the number you see on the screen. The programs that you have seen in recent weeks are a direct reflection from the input that we have received from you, our viewing audience. In order to continue the variety of ideas and thoughts in future programs, your further input is greatly needed. So please, feel free to contact IIS with any comments or ideas that you may have for future shows. Your participation will be greatly appreciated. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us this week on Islam.